Hello everyone, Jimmy here, and welcome to episode 14 of Omnifactory. As you can see here, we've got the update. The endgame update has hit, and with it, a really cool main menu. Let's just take a second to appreciate some of these really cool bases other people have built. I know, personally, I think I can build highly functional bases, but these pretty bases really get to me. Alright, anyways, let's load into the game and take a quick look at some of the changes. Alright, here we are. So I've been, since I updated, I've only logged into the world once really quick to make sure it works. So let's take a look at the changes now. Most of the changes have to do with the endgame, hence why I suppose it's called the endgame update. But the one that's most exciting to me, I believe, is this lunar mining station, which let me show. The multi-block looks like this. It's another modular machines multi-block, uses a fair number of ludicrous voltage machine casings, some energetic and stellar alloy. But generally, I think we can basically build all of those components, or at least we can almost build all of those components. But what it does, it produces deuterium and helium, which are mostly used for late game processing and for fusion fuels by gathering them off the moon. And you see, it has to be built on the moon. So previously, I wasn't intending on going to the moon. You know, all the stuff we get from the moon, we can already generate from microminers. But I think a trip to the moon might be in our near future. Besides that, most of the other changes were endgame balance changes, and we'll see them when we get there. The other significant change was, remember how we just updated our rocket fuel system to use the, I guess we can call it the proper recipe last episode, and we got rid of our old rocket fuel? Well, the old rocket fuel recipe is gone. So it's a good thing we made the changeover, right? We can no longer make rocket fuel in a chemical reactor directly anymore. Anyways, I'm going to do a quick once over of the base, make sure the update didn't break anything, and I'll be back once that's done. You guys remember last episode where we had an instance where the conduit connector wasn't quite connected to the ME conduit, or the ME cable? It's happened again. I'm kind of curious what causes this. It seems to happen when the server restarts, but yeah, if any of you have a solution for that, I'd love to know, because, well, when these get broken, it's kind of hard to tell, but I kind of have to like fly over the whole base and look over every connection to try to catch them. So it looks like the rest of our base survived the update without much issue. And now before we get into our progression tasks for the day, there's one thing I want to touch on. And I've had a lot of people ask me stuff like, hey Jimmy, why do you have one blast furnace processing each material, you know? I mean, can't you do this all in the same blast furnace? Or maybe, you know, use a couple less and just put an interface on it? Or same process, but with my alloy smelters doing, wherever they are. My alloy smelters that are processing like steel and all the steel variants. You know, this one's doing electrical steel, this one's doing steel, so on and so forth. So I want to highlight the difference between what I'm going to call on-demand versus auto-processing type automation. When you have on-demand operation, that is when you request something, right? If I go and request microminers and say, give me 20 of them, this is on-demand automation, because the steps are automated, but it's not crafting it until I, as a user, come and say, make this for me. On the other hand, something like this, right, that's always crafting it below, as long as we have below a threshold, is what I'm going to call auto-processing automation. And the difference between these two is that when stuff is auto-processed, you lock up the resources, right? The raw iron and the charcoal dust are forever locked up in these steel ingots, but when I want to use it, I don't have to wait for the crafting to finish. So let me give a perhaps more practical example. If all of my crafting is on demand and none of it is auto-processed, let's see what happens if I want to make those 10 diesel engines we made earlier. So 10 diesel engines takes 310 titanium and 640 annealed copper. And if I were to process everything on demand, that would very likely be our bottleneck. So let's take a look at how long that would take. Let's just do the titanium. So titanium ingots, remember, we need 310 of these, right? If we were to do it on demand, they take 40 seconds each at high voltage. I think our titanium maker might be extreme voltage. Let me check. Yeah, it is extreme voltage. So it overclocks from there, but it would take about 16, 17 seconds. Let's round, call it 15 seconds at extreme voltage to make one piece of titanium. So to make 310 of them, it would take just under an hour. So if I was to make all of our titanium on demand when I asked for it, it would take an hour to craft those 10 diesel engines. And that's just one component of the diesel, of the diesel multi-block. All the other parts of it will end up taking, 2, 3, maybe even 4 hours to craft, but from the time when I ask for it. So let me show you a graph, I guess, that might exemplify this a little better than if I'm, just talking about it. So, excuse my artistic talent, perhaps, but if we have this graph of time versus the number of machines we have processing, when we make a auto-crafting request right here, what we'll observe, right, is that basically immediately a lot of machines start running, and then over time, as they finish their tasks, the number of machines that are running drops down, eventually to 0. So if we have if all our processing is on-demand auto-crafting, if we make the request here, oh god, I can't write with the mouse. We don't get the product until here, right? This is when it's done. And this entire time between the request and when it's done, we're sitting here twiddling our thumbs waiting. Or perhaps more realistically, we go do something else. But if we change it such that we have auto processing, what happens is when you make the request, the same thing happens. All these machines spin up to refill your stock, but because the supplies are already crafted, your product is done here, right? It's done much sooner. So you don't actually reduce the amount of work your machines have to do, but you reduce the amount of time you have to wait between your request and when your result is done. And saving time is very valuable. And back to Minecraft. Our goal for today, as perhaps we discussed last episode, is to get our nuclear-craft fission reactor online. The nuclear-craft fission reactors, they're similar in structure to extreme reactors, but they have a pretty complicated interior design, and I'll be honest, I don't know the interior design mechanics very well. So what I did is I'm planning on borrowing a nuclear-craft reactor design from the internet. The one that I'm using, I found on the FTB Gamepedia wiki. So let me show you that really quick. And this is the design. So if you look at it, as designed, it is, like 7 layers tall with a 5x5 layers. Well, this design can be scaled both horizontally by making the layers, wider. Instead of 5x5, they'll be 7x7 or 9x9. And it can also be scaled vertically by repeating the pattern of this cryotheum water cryotheum layer over and over again. So you go, the cryotheum, water, cryotheum, and then you just cap it with this redstone and lapis layer. So I don't understand why this design is good. I just know that it is capable of burning fuel very quickly while keeping heat low so that you don't risk a meltdown. It uses quite a few materials, but that's the beauty of auto-crafting. We can auto-craft these materials. So once again, back to Minecraft. I'm just going to start encoding the patterns for all the coolers, and actually we already have some of them, and build all the components for this. So with an inventory filled to the brim with fission reactor components, let's start building this monster. I'm thinking we can put it down here by our ore processing. If in the unfortunate event that the reactor does melt down, the damage done is only to the reactor. It doesn't like fail explosively or anything, so that, you know, if it does melt down, it won't damage anything else. It won't explode like nuclear craft reactors or like IC2 reactors do. So I'm thinking I want it to be a 11 by 11 interior. Or sorry, a 9 by 9 interior. 11 by 11 might be a bit much. And then we'll just go to, I don't know, like 9 tall maybe? A 9 by 9 by 9? That seems reasonable, right? So let's just place all the components. I'll probably play this off at high speed so that you don't have to sit through the entire thing. Please work. Alright, I think it's good. Let's grab some fuel and test it real quick. So this is some of the, you know, basic fuel. So if you look here, if this heat per tick number is negative, you don't have to worry about meltdowns. You can run it forever without issue. And if this number is positive, I'll show you what we have to do to keep it from melting down. Although I suspect this reactor is heat per tick negative for all fuels we will use, but I'll put what I call the safety loop in regardless. Anyways, it appears to be working. Awesome. Let me set up the control logic for this next, and I'll start piping fuel into it, you know, piping fuel in and out automatically. And here's our first completed fission reactor. So I'm feeding it fuel through an ME interface with a crafting card in it that's set to craft PBU fuel. You probably don't need the full 64 at a time. And lowly enriched uranium-235. So these are our tier 1. What will happen is after these are done, you know, running in the reactor, they will produce this depleted fuel, which we can then centrifuge for various other components. And with these other components, we can, like here, we get plutonium and neptunium, and that these will contribute to our tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and ultimately tier 5 fuels. I will show a graphic, I guess, of the various fuel tiers I'm planning on using. It'll take some time for the reactor to churn through enough of the low tier fuel for us to start running the high tier stuff. But the goal is to produce all of the nuclear fuel, or the spent nuclear fuels we need to make omnium. So if we look omnium here, which this is a very intimidating looking recipe, but don't worry, it's one that we make progress on, you know, bit by bit. And specifically, the bit we're making progress on is down here. So that's uranium, neptunium, plutonium, americium, curium, berkelium, californium, and, well, einsteinium comes from something else. So we need to make all of these fuels. Now, after the fuels are done running in the reactor, they are extracted through here and put back into another ME interface where they're ingested into the system. And perhaps the most intimidating part of this setup is my meltdown prevention safety loop. This is a lot more complicated than it has to be. In all likelihood, you can put a lever on one of these ports and this reactor is 100% safe. But I haven't run the math on it to be sure, and it's probably a good idea just to put a safety loop on your reactors anyways. The loop you see here specifically, I guess let me walk you through how it works. Each of these fission reactor ports emits a redstone signal proportional to how full the heat bar is. So right now or a comparator signal proportional to how full the heat bar is. So right now it's 0. That's fine. I compare it to, or I subtract the value of this potentiometer. It can be in compare mode or subtract mode. It doesn't really matter. And so you subtract or compare the value to, a fixed value. This will be your cutoff value. And then in the simplest form, you invert that signal with a NOT gate and send it back into the reactor. Now, I discovered that the reactor doesn't like 1 tick long redstone signal flashes. Sometimes it causes it to get stuck. So this here is just a vanilla redstone pulse extender. Just a couple of comparators. You might not need it, but I found that my reactor sometimes gets stuck in the off state without it. And this timer here is to handle another bug where when the server starts up, the reactor is receiving a redstone signal, it doesn't start. So normally the reactor runs when any of its ports are receiving a redstone signal, but if any of them are receiving a redstone signal, when the server starts up, it doesn't start. So I just have a timer here set to the max amount, whatever it is, 10 minutes. That'll start the reactor if it's not running. And since it only pulses for 1 tick, or rather, it'll shut the reactor off for 1 tick every 10 minutes, and then it'll start back up on its own afterwards to fix the reboot issue. And lastly, I have a manual kill switch, which probably should be labeled, but if you flip this, the reactor turns off. And you see it's no longer processing fuel. So I'm going to let this run for a second while I prepare the other fuels, and then I'll add them here to our interface, and we can start auto-processing all of our nuclear fuels. While getting ready to process our depleted fuels, I noticed that our packagers for tiny dusts weren't running, and it took a look. The chest is full, but the machine seems to be jammed. So when I went to double-check the robotic arm settings, it seems like when the server rebooted, it forgot that it was on supply exact 9 mode. So this isn't the first time this has happened, and it seems to break every time that my server reboots. So if any of you out there happen to know a way to keep the robotic arms from forgetting their settings every time a server reboots, I'd like to know. Otherwise, I'd probably have to come up with some other solution for this, because having to fix all my robotic arms every time the server reboots is pretty annoying. And the same for like these that are packing by 4. Right, a single item gets left behind, although this one seems like it's fine. And I had to do the same thing to the other, like the electrolyzers working on tungsten elsewhere in the base. But anyways, back to what I was originally doing. These depleted fuels can just be run through a centrifuge to separate them into their fuel components, their depleted components. So I just add them to our ore processing centrifuges. There's no nuclear contamination or anything, so I don't need to worry about getting nuclear contamination on top of our ore processing or anything. While setting up the nuclear fuels for our reactor, I realized that apparently only the fission controller and not the reactor ports will emit the redstone signal. And I realized this when I put in a fuel that was very heat positive. Let me see if I can make some more to show you right now. So this what fuel was that? Americanium 242. It is extremely heat positive. So when it starts, let me give it a startup. No, it's not going to run. There we go. It is very heat positive, and in fact, it'll melt our reactor in very little time if left unchecked. So, yeah, I started running this. Why is this blinking? Oh, it's our loop working. So anyways, I started running this, and when I realized the heat wasn't, like, the heat was already up here, and I had to panic and come over and hit our kill switch. So I'm very glad we installed the kill switch. But yeah, just in case you're setting up your own reactors, make sure the comparator goes right up against the controller. Our reactor has now been running for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes, and it's now run long enough that we've been able to produce some of every fuel type that we want to use. So I've been able to craft some and add it to these interfaces with crafting cards so that they will craft them when they're available. And then it's basically just up to these item conduits to more or less randomly decide what fuel to burn next when we consume all of one. Right, so when we use all of our uranium-235 and can no longer produce any more of this, well, this will be empty. So one of the item conduits will grab another item and shove it in the reactor, and it'll start burning that. So that's a pretty, I'd call it a simple system to run all the different types of fuels off one reactor. We have, 3 here and 7. So we're running 10 different fuel types off a single reactor just by randomly choosing which fuel to run next. Now, while I was in the process of reprocessing these fuels, so as I said, when you're done running the fuels, you get depleted fuel, which you can then centrifuge into their components. Well, one of the components we get is tiny clumps of uranium-235. There's a small problem with this, and I don't actually know if it's worth solving, but uranium-235, the tiny clumps have 2 crafting recipes. They can either craft into these GregTech ingots or these nuclear craft piles. And to use the GregTech ingot can only be turned into the nuclear craft pile in the thermal centrifuge, which we know takes a lot of energy and time. So I'm thinking, well, the reason that matters is when you try to craft it, you only get the GregTech one. There's no way to say, hey, craft the other one for me instead. Well, there's no easy way to say, hey, craft the other one for me instead. If you are willing to craft it manually, you can go up here and use the forestry work table. I'm getting some frame rate lag up here all of a sudden. Anyways, in here, you can choose which one you get, right? But then you're crafting it manually. I don't really want to do that either. So, of the auto-crafting things in the pack, I think I have to stay downstairs now. The upstairs is a little too laggy. Of the auto-crafting tools in the pack, the only one I know that lets you choose between outputs when you have a conflict like that is the Logistics Pipes auto-crafting table. So to use the logistics crafting table, though, we actually need at least a small logistics pipes network. So it's a bit to explain how logistics pipes works, but fundamentally it's very similar to applied energistics in that you have effectively you can have like export buses and import buses and storage buses. They go by different names in logistics pipes, but they're functionally very similar. So we don't need to set up a full-blown logistics pipes network, thankfully. We only need to set up enough to do auto-crafting with it. So give me a bit to gather up the components for that. It's been a long time since I've done logistics pipes, so I might be a little rusty here. Let's see how long it takes for me to figure this out. Wow, logistics pipes has changed a lot in the last couple years. So their crafting system seems like it's been completely changed. A lot of their recipes, when you start doing crafting, use these logistics programmers, and they're not consumed in the recipes. But think of them like the program circuits in GregTech machines. These program circuits, right, that have a configuration number. Likewise, these have a configuration state, except you can't just right-click one of them to change their state. So when you first craft them, you see it says no valid program loaded. So to use it, you have to flash a program onto it. Well, that's a little complicated. First, you have to build a logistics program compiler and connect it to a logistics pipe system. The power junction is really the only thing you need at this point. Think of the power junction like the hey, items are going. Think of the power junction like the energy acceptor for applied energistics. So, you build a logistics program compiler, put a logistics disk in it, and your programmer. Then you have to pick one of these categories to unlock. So, say, start with basic and click unlock. This process takes like 2 minutes. So instead of waiting for it, we're going to come over here where I have already unlocked basic, at least I think I did basic, logistics pipe thing. So basically, I already clicked basic and unlock, and then let me grab another. Actually, I have one. I put my programmer in here, and I can choose one of these. Well, they start off all red, so I choose one of those and click compile, and compile unlocks it again. So first you unlock it in the left side, then you unlock it in the right side, and then you pick an unlocked one on the right side and you flash it onto your programmer. And then and only then do you have a programmed programmer. And now this programmer specifically can be used to make crafting logistics pipes. So besides that, the crafting recipes aren't terribly weird. It's just a bunch of, basic-ish items. They use some of their own chips, but these are all reasonably cheap items. So, yeah, that's, I guess, the logistics pipes crafting system. Now on to what we actually wanted to do with logistics pipes. The logistics crafting table has a nice feature where you can choose which of the outputs you want, which is, again, the feature we were after. So we want to craft uranium-235, but we want to get this version, not this version. So we import the recipe, make sure it's set to this, and then we take a wrench, or it has to be the logistics crafting table has to be connected to a crafting logistics pipe. You right-click the pipe, and then you can just click import, and it'll import the recipe. I don't know why it's showing red. Generally, red spots on the corners means something's not working. And I don't know what that is. But anyways, moving on. You set up this crafting system, and then to connect it to your applied energistics network, you have an ME interface with a pattern in it that'll push the tiny clumps of uranium into this chest, or this crate. On this crate, I have a provider logistics pipe, and a provider pipe is, think of it like a storage bus that can only extract. So this provider pipe it's saying all the items that are in this chest will be available for the logistics pipe system to see. And this logistics request table is very similar to our the crafting terminal that we have for applied logistics. So again, logistics pipes is basically applied logistics, just done slightly differently, with a slightly different feature set. Anyways, our provider pipe then lets us see these tiny clumps of uranium when they're in the system. And lastly, we have a logistics chassis here. There's not really equivalent for the chassis in applied logistics. A chassis just lets you apply the functions of multiple pipes in one. So in this chassis, I have an active supplier module that's configured to send as much uranium-235 big clumps back into the applied energistics system as it can. So the idea is when you order uranium-235 from the applied energistics network, let's ask for 100. It'll says, okay, if we look at the recipe in here, right? With 9 tiny clumps of uranium, it produces 1 big clump. So if we ask for 100, it'll take 900 tiny clumps and dump them all into here. Then what'll happen is that in the logistics pipe system, it'll see, hey, I have all this uranium-235, and I can use it to satisfy this active supplier module, which is configured to, well, send uranium-235. So what'll happen is as quickly as it can, it'll pull items and send them into this crafting table, which will craft it into the uranium-235 and then send it back. How cool is that? So using this, it's a bit of a complicated workaround, but it lets us automatically choose which recipe we want. It's pretty fun to watch these items just bounce back and forth all day long. But perhaps we should do something a little bit more productive. So we have a little bit of time left this episode. I think it's time we tackled easier circuits. So if we look at the indium we started making last episode in our specialized ore processing, right? We are reacting sphalerite with galena to produce indium concentrate, and then ultimately to produce tiny piles of indium. Well, with some of that indium that we've gathered up we can make this indium gallium phosphide, which is part of making qubit CPU wafers, which is used to make qubit CPUs, which lastly are used to make quantum circuits, right? Everything else in here is stuff we have already been making. But quantum circuits are the final tier 4 process or circuit, which means we have much easier access to tier 4 circuits, and subsequently they can be used to make tier 5 circuits more easily, and tier 6 circuits more easily, and eventually, I guess even in the assembly line, they can be used to make tier 7 circuits. So let me go set up a small process that'll make that those qubit CPUs for us. And just like it all, spread out all over our base, we have another dedicated machine to making qubit CPUs. So we have an interface that's set to stock nano CPUs and indium gallium phosphide dust, and then a chemical reactor that does the reaction of export bus provides the fluid, and a level emitter set to turn it off once we reach 500s. Once the wafers are made, they're sent over to our cutting machine here with an export bus, where they just get cut from the wafer form into the individual CPUs form. Sorry for that lag. Next, all we have to do is encode the recipe for the higher tiers of circuits. Okay, I drew up the patterns, put them in here with our assembly machine. This is a insane voltage assembly machine, so you have to use the IV assembler to build these higher tier circuits. But it's actually been a few hours, real lifetime since I recorded the last segment, and I also set up this system between segments where I'm stock keeping a bunch of circuits and a bunch of microminers. The microminers I had already set up before, but the circuits here, I'm intentionally stock keeping 1,000 of each of the circuits that we can craft directly, so up through tier 4. And this is because, remember when I said for processing, if you have the stuff available when you start a crafting task, it makes it take a lot less time to craft. And I was noticing that finishing up circuits was often the last thing that happened when I did an on-demand craft. So let's see, now that I'm intentionally stocking a huge supply of circuits, what our bottleneck might be. Let's try crafting 16 maybe insane voltage macerators. We'll use these. This is a reasonably expensive craft, right? 250 tungsten steel, 1,000 annealed copper, but whatever. Let's start it up and see what our bottleneck is. I guess this one isn't even using the basic tier circuits. It's using stuff we had stockpiled already from something else, but that's okay. So you can see here, even in, I guess it's in real time, but I expect this one will take maybe 2 or 3 minutes total. But I think that's pretty good considering if we were to craft all the components on demand, right, this would have taken a couple hours. And it looks like our bottleneck will be the wire mill. Or maybe the next thing we want to speed up would be our wire mill. It's like we're right at the end now. So in total, crafting, because of all the stock keeping we're doing, crafting 16 insane voltage macerators only took, maybe 2 minutes? I think that's pretty darn quick. So I hope this really showcases the power of keeping materials in stock as opposed to trying to do everything on demand. I understand it's simpler to craft on demand, but you really save yourself a lot of time in the long run by stock keeping all your commonly used materials. So with that, let's call it an end to this episode. I'm glad we were able to get our nuclear reactor online, and now that it's producing, it'll just passively run for probably a couple hours to a couple days before we use up our fuel supply. And at that point, we should have plenty of stockpiled, the heavy nucleotides that we can use in crafting and for microminers going forward. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hope to see you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.